I still remember the look on my husband's face the moment everything fell apart. Richard Bates stood across the room wearing that familiar expression, the one that said he was certain I would forgive him again. After 35 years of marriage, he believed tears would come first, then excuses, then another chance. Instead, I walked past him and placed a thick envelope into Megan Harper's trembling hands. As she pulled out the photographs, bank records, and messages, the color drained from her face. For the first time that evening, Richard looked afraid. And that was when I realized the woman he had betrayed most wasn't me. It was the woman he thought would help him escape. If you've ever had someone mistake your kindness for weakness, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I'm Elaine. And this is the story of the day I finally stopped forgiving Richard Bates. My name is Elaine Bates. And until 2 years ago, I believed I would spend the rest of my life married to the same man. At 64 years old, I thought I had already lived through every challenge a marriage could face. Financial struggles, raising children, health scares, the loss of parents, career setbacks, the ordinary disappointments that come with sharing a life with another imperfect human being. What I didn't understand was that sometimes the most dangerous storms arrive after you think you've survived them all. Richard and I had been married for 35 years. 35. Just saying that number still feels strange. It's longer than some people spend building careers, longer than many people stay in the same town, longer than my daughter Sarah had even been alive. When we met, I was 29 and teaching 3rd grade at a small elementary school outside Columbus, Ohio. Richard was 32, ambitious, charming, and already building a reputation in the local construction business. Everyone liked him. That was one of the first things I noticed. The waitresses remembered his name. Neighbors stopped to talk when he walked down the street. People laughed at his jokes. Men wanted to be his friend. Women paid attention when he entered a room. Back then, I took pride in that. I thought I was lucky, and for many years, I truly was. We built a life together. Not a perfect one, but a good one. We bought our first small house when Sarah was a baby. A few years later, our son Daniel was born. We spent weekends coaching Little League, attending school plays, helping with science projects, and worrying about mortgage payments. Like most couples, we had arguments. Some were small, some were painful, but we always found our way back to each other. Or at least, that's what I believed. The older we became, the more people admired our marriage. Church friends often told us we were an example of commitment. Neighbors described us as one of those couples who would grow old together. Even our children viewed us that way, especially after Richard's business became successful. By his 60s, he owned a respected construction company and had earned a reputation as a hardworking family man. If you had asked anyone in our town what they thought of Richard Bates, they would have described him as trustworthy, reliable, honorable, the kind of man who always did the right thing. Sometimes I wondered if they knew a different version of him than I did, because there were things people never saw. Nothing dramatic at first, just small cracks, tiny disappointments, moments that seemed too insignificant to mention. Richard had always been good at apologizing. That sounds like a positive quality, doesn't it? But over time, I learned that some people become skilled at apologizing because they have so much practice needing forgiveness. The first major disappointment came nearly 20 years into our marriage. I discovered he had hidden a credit card account from me. The balance wasn't enormous, a few $1,000s. But the secrecy hurt more than the debt. When I confronted him, he looked devastated. He said he was embarrassed. He said he hadn't wanted to worry me. He promised it would never happen again. I forgave him. Years later, there was another incident. I learned he had loaned a substantial amount of money to a friend without discussing it with me. Again, he apologized. Again, he looked ashamed. Again, he promised complete honesty going forward. Again, I forgave him. The pattern continued throughout our marriage. Not affairs. Not then. At least, not that I knew of. Instead, it was a series of smaller betrayals, half-truths, secrets. Financial decisions made behind my back. Promises forgotten. Important conversations avoided. Each individual event seemed too minor to destroy a marriage. And Richard always knew exactly what to say afterward. He would take my hands, look directly into my eyes, tell me how much he loved me, tell me how grateful he was for our family, tell me I was his best friend, his partner, the most important person in his life. Then he would ask for forgiveness, and I would give it every time. Looking back now, I often ask myself why. Why did I keep forgiving him? Part of the answer is simple. I loved him. Another part is more complicated. I was raised to believe marriage required sacrifice, compromise, patience, especially when you had already invested decades into a relationship. By the time you reach your 60s, leaving doesn't feel like an option, or at least it didn't to me. The idea of starting over seemed terrifying. So I convinced myself every marriage had secrets, every husband made mistakes, every wife learned to accept imperfections. Besides, Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He didn't drink excessively. He showed up to family events. He loved our children. Or at least he appeared to. That made it easier to overlook the warning signs. The older we became, the more determined I was to preserve our family. When Sarah married her husband, I remember standing beside Richard at the reception, watching our daughter dance with her new husband, watching our grandchildren run across the floor, feeling grateful, thinking we'd made it, thinking we had survived the difficult years, thinking the future would finally be peaceful. I couldn't have been more wrong, because while I was looking toward retirement and family gatherings, Richard was quietly becoming someone I no longer recognized. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. It was simply a feeling, a subtle discomfort, an instinct I couldn't explain. Sometimes I would catch him staring at his phone and smiling. Not the smile he gave our grandchildren, not the smile he gave friends. A different smile, a private smile, one that disappeared the moment he noticed me watching. Whenever I asked what was funny, he'd answer casually, "Just something from work." And I would nod, because after 35 years of marriage, you're supposed to trust your husband, right? Still, something felt different. something felt off. I ignored that feeling for months, maybe longer. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself age had made me overly sensitive. I told myself I was lucky to have the life I had. But deep inside, a small voice kept whispering the same warning. Elaine, pay attention. I wish I had listened sooner. Because while I was busy protecting our marriage, Richard was already protecting something else. And soon, I would discover exactly what that was. The strange feeling I mentioned at the end of the last chapter didn't arrive all at once. It crept into my life quietly, like a draft under a door, small enough to ignore. At first, after 35 years of marriage, you develop routines so deeply that you stop noticing them. You know what time your spouse wakes up, what side of the bed they sleep on, how they stir their coffee, which television programs they pretend not to enjoy but always watch anyway. You know them, or at least you think you do. That's why the changes stood out. Not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. The first thing I noticed was Richard's phone. For decades, he'd left it lying around without concern. Kitchen counters, living room tables, his recliner, the garage workbench, anywhere. Then suddenly, it was always with him. Always. If he walked to the mailbox, the phone went with him. If he stepped outside to check the weather, the phone went with him. Even when he took out the trash, the phone went with him. One afternoon, I laughed and asked, "Are you expecting a call from the president?" He smiled, but the smile seemed forced. Business never sleeps. That answer should have sounded reasonable. After all, he owned a construction company. But something about the way he said it bothered me. A few days later, I noticed another change. Richard began placing his phone face down whenever he entered a room. Every single time. The screen was never visible. Notifications never appeared. Messages never flashed. The device might as well have been a brick. One evening, while we were watching television, I saw the phone light up. Just briefly. A message had arrived. Richard grabbed it so quickly that it startled me. I don't think he even realized how obvious he looked. For a moment, our eyes met. Then he casually stood up. "I need a glass of water." He disappeared into the kitchen. With the phone, I remember sitting there on the couch staring at the dark television screen, feeling foolish, embarrassed, like a suspicious old woman inventing problems where none existed. I told myself not to overreact, but the uncomfortable feeling remained. Weeks passed. Then another change appeared. Richard started working late. Frequently. Far more frequently than before. At 67 years old. He should have been slowing down. Delegating responsibilities. Enjoying retirement. Instead, he suddenly seemed busier than ever. There were meetings, client dinners, emergency site visits, weekend obligations, unexpected phone calls. I heard excuses so often that I could predict them before he spoke. One Friday evening, he called while I was setting the table. "Don't wait for me." "Another meeting?" I asked. "Unfortunately." I looked at the roast I'd spent hours preparing. The candles already lit. The table set for two. "How late?" "Not sure." His answer came too quickly. as if he'd rehearsed it. When he finally arrived home after 10 o'clock, he smelled different. Not like alcohol, not like food. Something else, something floral. Perfume. A woman's perfume. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard noticed me sniffing the air. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. For a split second, I considered asking directly, "Who were you with instead?" I said, "You smell different." His expression changed. Only briefly, but I saw it. A flash of panic. Then it disappeared. I hugged a client goodbye. A client? Of course. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Except it didn't feel reasonable. Not to me. The perfume lingered long after he walked away. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, listening to Richard snore beside me, wondering if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I called my daughter Sarah. Not because I intended to accuse Richard of anything. I just needed someone to talk to, someone to reassure me. After describing some of the recent changes, I waited for her response. Instead, she laughed softly. "Mom, Dad loves you." "I know." "You're probably overthinking." Maybe she was right. I wanted her to be right. "You know how Grandpa got paranoid when he got older?" she continued. "Sometimes people start seeing things that aren't really there." The comment wasn't cruel. Sarah meant well. But it stung. Because part of me had already begun wondering the same thing. Was I imagining everything? Was age making me suspicious? Maybe. For a few days, I tried harder to ignore my concerns. I focused on gardening, reading, spending time with my grandchildren. Anything to keep my mind occupied. Then came the text messages. Not the messages themselves. The reactions to them. One afternoon, Richard was sitting on our back porch. I watched him through the kitchen window. His phone buzzed. He looked down and smiled. Not a polite smile. Not amusement. Something warmer. Something intimate. A smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. A knot formed in my stomach. Before I realized what I was doing, I stepped closer to the window. Richard typed a response, then looked around, almost nervously, as though checking whether anyone was watching. That was the moment fear truly entered my heart. Not certainty. Fear. Because instincts are strange things. Sometimes they know the truth before your mind is ready to accept it. After that day, I began paying closer attention. I noticed how often he disappeared into another room to answer calls. I noticed how quickly he closed apps whenever I walked by. I noticed how protective he had become of his privacy. But the most painful thing wasn't the behavior itself. It was the distance. Richard seemed emotionally absent, physically present, emotionally gone. At dinner, his mind wandered. During conversations, he seemed distracted. When our grandchildren visited, he smiled and laughed, but it felt performative somehow, like a man acting a role. One evening, I found an old photo album in the closet. I sat alone in the living room, flipping through pages. There we were, young, happy, standing beside our first house, holding newborn Sarah, laughing during vacations, celebrating anniversaries, building a life. Richard walked into the room and saw me looking through the album. For a brief moment, sadness crossed his face. Real sadness. Not fake. Not rehearsed. Real. Then it vanished. "What are you doing?" he asked, remembering. He nodded. "Those were good years." Were, not are. Were. I don't know why that word affected me so much, but it did, because it sounded like someone talking about a chapter that had already ended. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom. Not because I knew Richard was cheating. I didn't. Not yet. I cried because for the first time, I was afraid I no longer knew the man sleeping beside me. And deep down, a terrifying question had begun forming. What if the problem wasn't in my imagination? What if my instincts were trying to warn me? What if Richard wasn't hiding stress, or work problems, or retirement worries? What if he was hiding someone at that point? I still didn't have proof. Only questions. But questions have a way of leading you toward answers. And very soon, I was about to find one I could never unsee. The answer came on a Tuesday night. Not during some dramatic confrontation. Not through a private investigator. Not from a confession. It arrived because Richard made a mistake. The kind of mistake people make when they've been lying for too long. By then, I had spent months questioning my instincts. Months telling myself I was imagining things. Months accepting explanations that never quite made sense. But that Tuesday night changed everything. Richard had come home late again. Another client dinner. Another apology. Another promise that things would settle down soon. I remember watching him eat leftovers at the kitchen counter while talking about some construction project. He seemed relaxed, comfortable, confident, as though he believed every excuse he gave me. Later that evening, we sat in the living room watching television. A baseball game neither of us was really paying attention to. Richard gradually drifted off to sleep in his recliner. That wasn't unusual. He often fell asleep after long days, around 10 o'clock. I stood up to head toward the bedroom. That's when I heard it. A vibration. Soft. Brief. Coming from Richard's phone. Normally, I would have ignored it. But something made me stop. Maybe instinct. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe God finally deciding I'd suffered enough uncertainty. The phone was resting on the small table beside his chair. The screen lit up. Just for a second. Long enough. Long enough for me to see a name. Megan. My heart stopped. Not literally, but that's how it felt. One moment, I was breathing normally. The next, I couldn't seem to pull enough air into my lungs. I stared at the screen, certain I had misread it, certain there had to be another explanation. Then another notification appeared. This time, I saw more. A preview message. "Miss you already." I felt the room tilt. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even blink. 35 years. 35 years together. And suddenly, everything I believed about my life seemed fragile, uncertain, false. Richard remained asleep, completely unaware. The television flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look like a stranger. I looked at him. really looked at him, and for the first time in decades, I felt nothing resembling safety. I felt fear, not fear of violence, fear of truth. Because once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. You can't return to ignorance. You can't pretend. You can't convince yourself things are fine. The message remained on the screen, waiting. My hands trembled. I had never snooped through Richard's phone before. Not once. Even during the periods when I suspected something was wrong, I believed privacy mattered. Trust mattered. But trust had already been broken. I just hadn't admitted it yet. Slowly, I picked up the phone. My pulse pounded so loudly I could hear it. To my surprise, the device wasn't locked. Maybe he'd forgotten. Maybe he was careless. Maybe after months of deception, he'd grown overconfident. Whatever the reason, the screen opened, and my world collapsed. The messages stretched back for months. Months. Not days. Not weeks. Months. I began reading. Each text felt like a knife sliding deeper. Good morning. Beautiful. Can't stop thinking about tonight. Wish I was waking up next to you. You deserve so much better than what I'm living through. I had to stop reading. Tears blurred my vision. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. I froze, but he continued sleeping. The messages continued too. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Photos, plans, private jokes, affectionate nicknames. Conversations about the future. Conversations about vacations. Conversations about dreams. A life. An entire hidden life. And then I found something that hurt even more than the affair itself. Richard had been talking about me, about our marriage, about our family, about me, according to the messages. I was distant, cold, uninterested, emotionally unavailable, a wife who no longer cared, a woman he remained with only out of obligation. I stared at those words in disbelief. For months, I had been cooking his meals, washing his clothes, supporting his business, defending him to our children, building our life, and all the while, he was portraying me as some cruel obstacle standing between him and happiness. I felt sick, physically sick. The bathroom wasn't far away. I rushed inside and locked the door. For several minutes, I simply sat on the edge of the bathtub, trying not to fall apart, trying not to scream, trying not to wake the entire neighborhood. Every memory suddenly felt contaminated. Every anniversary, every holiday, every family gathering. Had he been texting her while sitting beside me at Thanksgiving dinner? Had he been thinking about her during our vacations? Had he laughed at private messages while pretending to listen to our grandchildren? The questions came faster than I could answer them. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I splashed cold water on my face. Then I did something that surprised even me. I became calm. Not because I wasn't hurt, because I was. More than words can describe. But beneath the heartbreak, another feeling emerged. Clarity. Pure, terrifying clarity. I realized something important. If I confronted Richard immediately, he'd lie. He'd apologize. He'd cry. He'd manipulate. He'd tell half-truths. And somehow, he'd regain control of the situation. No, I couldn't allow that. Not this time. For the first time in our marriage, I chose patience over emotion. I returned to the living room. Richard was still asleep. I sat quietly beside him. Then I began taking photographs. Every message, every conversation, every image, every piece of evidence I could find. My phone filled rapidly. I emailed copies to myself, created backups, stored everything. By the time I finished, nearly an hour had passed. The evidence wasn't just proof of an affair. It was proof of deception, planning, manipulation, months of calculated dishonesty. Before placing the phone back where I'd found it, I opened one final conversation. A recent exchange. Megan had written, "When are you finally going to tell her?" Richard's response came seconds later. "Soon. I just need everything lined up first." Everything lined up. The words haunted me. What exactly was he lining up? A divorce? A financial arrangement? A new life? I didn't know. But I intended to find out. That night, I climbed into bed beside my husband. For 35 years, that space had felt familiar, safe, comforting. Now it felt foreign. I listened to him breathing, listened to the man who had spent months lying to my face, the man who believed I knew nothing, the man who thought he was in control. Tears rolled silently down my cheeks. But I made myself a promise. I would not confront him tomorrow. I would not reveal what I knew. I would not give him an opportunity to destroy evidence or prepare excuses. Instead, I would learn everything, every lie, every secret, every hidden plan, and then I would decide what happened next. As dawn approached, I finally closed my eyes, not because I felt peace, because I understood that my marriage, as I had known it, was already over. Richard just didn't know it yet, and neither did the woman named Megan. The hardest part about discovering an affair isn't always the betrayal. Sometimes it's what happens afterward. The silence, the pretending, the loneliness of carrying a truth that no one else knows. For weeks after finding the messages between Richard and Megan, I lived two lives. There was the version everyone else saw, the smiling wife, the supportive mother, the grandmother attending soccer games and birthday parties, the woman whose marriage appeared stable. Then there was the version nobody saw, the woman who woke up every morning beside a stranger, the woman who secretly documented evidence, the woman trying to understand how her entire life had become a lie. What surprised me most wasn't Richard's ability to deceive me. It was how effortlessly he continued playing the role of devoted husband. If anything, he became more attentive, more affectionate, more charming, almost as if guilt had made him determined to compensate. Or maybe he simply wanted to make sure I remained unsuspecting. One Saturday morning, he arrived home carrying flowers, yellow roses, my favorite. At least they used to be. "Thought these might brighten your day," he said. I stared at the bouquet. The same man who had texted another woman "Good morning, beautiful" the night before was now handing me flowers. I forced a smile. "Thank you." He kissed my forehead. The gesture felt rehearsed, artificial. like an actor hitting a familiar mark on stage. That evening, he suggested dinner at one of our favorite restaurants, a place we'd been visiting for nearly 20 years. We sat in the same booth, ordered the same meals, had the same conversations. Yet everything felt different. I watched him laugh, watched him tell stories, watched him reach across the table and squeeze my hand. And I wondered how many times he'd done the same thing with Megan. The thought made me physically ill. Still, I said nothing because I needed information, not emotional satisfaction. Information. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer a disturbing pattern became. Richard wasn't simply having an affair. He was maintaining two completely separate realities. In one reality, he was my husband, family man, grandfather, community leader. In the other, he was building an entirely different future, one that apparently didn't include me. A few days later, Sarah stopped by unexpectedly. My daughter had inherited many of Richard's qualities: his confidence, his optimism, his tendency to believe the best about people. We sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee. For nearly an hour, I debated whether to tell her. Part of me desperately wanted support, someone to carry the burden with me. Finally, I decided to test the waters. "Have you noticed anything different about your father lately?" Sarah looked up. "Different how?" I shrugged. "Distracted, maybe." She laughed softly. "Mom, Dad's getting older." "So am I." "He's probably stressed." I stirred my coffee, trying to sound casual. "What if it was something else?" Sarah frowned. "What are you asking?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The messages, the lies, the late-night conversations. Instead, I hesitated, and that hesitation changed everything, because Sarah immediately interpreted my silence. "Oh, no." "What? You think Dad's having an affair?" The words sounded ridiculous coming from someone else's mouth. Sarah shook her head before I could answer. "Mom, that's impossible." Impossible. The same word I would have used months earlier. "You don't know that." "I know Dad." I almost laughed. "No. You know the version he shows you. There's a difference." But I kept that thought to myself. Sarah continued. "He adores you." I looked away. "He always has." The irony nearly broke my heart, because if she had seen the messages, she wouldn't have sounded so certain. Before leaving, Sarah hugged me tightly. "Try not to worry so much. Try not to worry. If only it were that simple." A few days later, I spoke with Daniel. The conversation went even worse. My son had always admired Richard. Growing up, he'd viewed his father as a hero, a self-made businessman, a provider, a role model. I approached the subject carefully, but the result was identical. "Dad would never do that." Never. That word again. Never. The certainty in his voice made me realize something painful. Richard's reputation protected him, not just in public, within our own family. If I confronted him now without overwhelming evidence, there was a chance people would believe him instead of me. That realization terrified me. Not because I doubted the truth, because I understood how skilled Richard had become at controlling narratives. Then things got worse, much worse. The gaslighting began. At first, it was subtle. So subtle, I almost missed it. One evening, Richard asked why I seemed distant. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. He was the one having an affair, yet somehow I was being questioned. "I'm just tired. You've seemed upset lately." I studied his face. Was he genuinely concerned, or gathering information I couldn't tell anymore? When I didn't answer, he continued, "Sometimes I think retirement has been hard on you." The comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean, you spend a lot of time alone?" I felt my chest tighten. "Are you saying I'm imagining things?" Richard raised both hands immediately. No. Classic Richard. Always careful. Always reasonable. "I'm saying loneliness can affect people." Loneliness. The word landed like a slap. Because I was lonely, but not for the reason he implied. I was lonely because my husband had emotionally abandoned our marriage. Yet somehow he was suggesting my concerns stemmed from isolation. Not his behavior. Mine. Over the following weeks, similar comments appeared. "You seem more emotional lately." "Maybe you're overthinking." "Not everything is a problem." "You worry too much." Each statement sounded harmless on its own. Together they formed something dangerous. A campaign. A subtle attempt to make me question my own judgment. The frightening part, sometimes it worked. There were nights when I lay awake wondering whether I had become paranoid, whether grief and aging had distorted my perspective, whether I truly was seeing problems everywhere. Then I would open the evidence folder on my laptop, and reality returned. The messages, the photographs, the lies. Those weren't imagination. Those were facts. One Friday afternoon, I watched Richard through our living room window as he stood outside talking on his phone. He looked relaxed, happy, smiling. Then he laughed, a deep, genuine laugh, the kind I hadn't heard directed at me in months. When the call ended, he entered the house. The smile vanished instantly, like someone switching off a light. For a brief second, our eyes met, and something inside me changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, permanently, for months. I had been focused on proving the affair. Now I realized something else. The affair wasn't the entire problem. The deeper betrayal was the manipulation, the lies. The way Richard expected me to doubt myself while he continued deceiving everyone around him. That evening, I opened my evidence folder again. Only this time, I created a second folder. I named it simply Truth, because sooner or later, the truth would matter. And when that day arrived, I intended to be ready. What I didn't know yet was that my investigation was about to reveal something even more shocking than the affair itself. Because Megan Harper wasn't the only person Richard had been deceiving. And the next discovery would change everything. For a long time. I believed Megan Harper was the enemy. That was the easiest version of the story to tell myself. A younger woman enters the picture. A husband loses his judgment. A marriage falls apart. Simple, clean, understandable. But life rarely follows simple stories. And the more I learned about Megan, the more uncomfortable I became with my own assumptions. The realization began by accident. At that point, I wasn't trying to investigate Megan herself. My focus remained on Richard. His lies, his finances, his plans, his secrets. Megan was simply a name attached to the affair, a face I hadn't yet seen, a person I imagined but didn't know. That changed one rainy Thursday afternoon. Richard had left for another business meeting. By then, I automatically placed quotation marks around almost everything he said. Business meeting, client dinner, late project, emergency call. Every explanation sounded hollow. After he left, I sat at my desk, reviewing copies of the messages I'd collected. I had organized them by date. Patterns had started emerging. Particular phrases appeared repeatedly. Certain promises. Certain stories. One conversation caught my attention. Megan had written, "I don't want to keep feeling like a secret." Richard responded almost immediately, "You won't be a secret much longer." Another message followed. "I told you, Elaine and I have been emotionally separated for years." Emotionally separated. I frowned. A few days later, I found another message. "I stay because leaving suddenly would hurt the kids." The kids, Sarah was 39. Daniel was 36. Neither lived at home. Neither depended on us financially. The excuse made no sense. Then I found another. "Once the house situation is settled, everything changes." And another. "My marriage has been over for a long time." Over. The word lingered in my mind. Because it wasn't true. We still lived together. Shared meals, shared holidays, shared a bedroom, shared every appearance of a functioning marriage. Maybe not a perfect one, but certainly not a dead one. Suddenly, a disturbing possibility occurred to me. What if Megan didn't know the truth? What if Richard wasn't simply deceiving me? What if he was deceiving her too? The thought refused to leave me. For days, I replayed conversations in my head, reread messages, examined details. Eventually, curiosity became stronger than anger. I needed answers. Not assumptions. Answers. So, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I looked Megan Harper up online. The search wasn't difficult. Her social media profiles were public. Her professional information was easy to find. Within minutes, I was staring at photographs of the woman I had spent months hating. She wasn't what I expected. That sounds strange. I know, but after discovering an affair, your imagination creates monsters, homewreckers, manipulators, women who enjoy causing pain. Instead, I found pictures of an ordinary woman, a middle-aged woman, not a young model, not some glamorous fantasy, just a woman. Photographs showed her hiking, attending charity events, celebrating birthdays with friends, posing with what appeared to be nieces and nephews. There was something unexpectedly normal about her life, something human. And that made everything more complicated. Over the following weeks, I continued watching from a distance. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, only information anyone could see. The more I learned, the less the situation fit the story I had originally imagined. Megan seemed genuinely invested in Richard. Not casually involved, not playing games, emotionally invested. One social media post especially caught my attention. It had been written several months earlier. The post didn't mention Richard by name, but the meaning was obvious. Sometimes the hardest thing is waiting for someone you love to finish a chapter they should have left years ago. The comments underneath were full of encouragement. Stay strong. Love is worth waiting for. Good things take time. My stomach sank, because suddenly I understood. Megan believed she was waiting for a man trapped in an unhappy marriage. A man trying to leave gracefully. A man preparing for a future with her. Not a man sleeping beside his wife every night. Not a man celebrating anniversaries. Not a man presenting himself as happily married. That realization disturbed me far more than I expected. A week later, another discovery made things worse. I found messages discussing future plans, vacation destinations, housing possibilities, retirement dreams. Richard wasn't talking like someone having an affair. He was talking like someone selling a future, and Megan was buying it completely. One message hit me particularly hard. Megan wrote, "I feel guilty sometimes." Richard replied, "You shouldn't. She's moved on emotionally years ago. She doesn't even want a real marriage anymore." I stared at those words until tears blurred my vision. Because they described someone I didn't recognize. Certainly not me. I hadn't moved on. I hadn't stopped caring. I hadn't abandoned our marriage. I was the one still fighting for it. Even now. Even after everything. The more evidence I gathered, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Richard had created two completely different versions of reality. To me, he was the devoted husband working hard to provide for his family. To Megan, he was the trapped man waiting for freedom. Both versions couldn't be true. Maybe neither version was. One afternoon, I parked across the street from a small cafe after noticing it mentioned repeatedly in their messages. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Maybe I simply wanted to see her, to understand who she was, to understand why my husband had risked everything. About 20 minutes later, Megan arrived. She sat alone near a window, waiting. Eventually, Richard appeared. My chest tightened immediately. Not because they were together. I already knew that. Because of the way they looked at each other. There was genuine affection there. Real emotion. Not performance. Not manipulation. At least not on Megan's side. She smiled when he sat down. Reached for his hand. Looked relieved to see him. The expression reminded me of myself decades earlier. Back when I believed everything Richard told me. For nearly an hour, I watched them talk, laugh, share stories, plan something. Then Richard leaned forward and kissed her hand. A gesture I hadn't received in years. The sight hurt. Of course it hurt. But another emotion appeared alongside the pain. Pity. Unexpected pity. Because as I watched Megan's face, I realized something. She wasn't behaving like a woman stealing another woman's husband. She was behaving like a woman in love. A woman who believed promises. A woman trusting someone she shouldn't. And suddenly, I saw the situation differently. Not as a triangle, not as a competition, not as wife versus mistress, but as two women standing on opposite sides of the same lie. One being deceived openly, the other secretly. That realization changed everything. For the first time, my anger shifted, not away from the affair, not away from the betrayal, but toward the person responsible for creating both realities. Richard, the man who lied to me, the man who lied to Megan, the man who carefully crafted whatever story each woman needed to hear. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen long after midnight, thinking, processing, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. Until then, I had imagined exposing Megan, destroying her illusion, making her feel the pain I felt. Now I wasn't so sure, because the deeper truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Megan wasn't living inside the truth either. She was living inside Richard's version of it. And if that was true, then the real battle ahead wasn't between me and her. It was between both of us and a man who believed he could control the lives of everyone around him. I didn't know it yet, but that realization would eventually lead me to make the most unexpected decision of my life. And before everything was over, it would bring me face to face with a truth far uglier than infidelity. Because Richard wasn't only hiding a relationship, he was hiding money, plans, and a future he intended to build without either of us knowing the full cost. The affair broke my heart. What I discovered next nearly destroyed me. Until then, I believed Richard's greatest betrayal was emotional. I thought the lies, the secret relationship, and the manipulation were the worst things he had done. I was wrong. The affair was only part of the story. The deeper betrayal was financial, calculated, deliberate, and terrifying. The realization began with a conversation that almost didn't happen. A few days after my discoveries about Megan, I found myself sitting in the office of attorney Linda Foster. I had chosen her carefully. She was highly respected, experienced, and, perhaps most importantly, discreet. Walking into her office felt surreal. I had never spoken to a divorce lawyer before. Never imagined I would. For 35 years, divorce belonged to other people. People whose marriages failed. People whose lives fell apart. Not us. Not the Bates family. At least, that's what I had always believed. Linda greeted me warmly. She looked to be in her early 60s, confident, calm, the kind of woman who made you feel safe almost immediately. After we sat down, she asked a simple question. "What brings you here today?" "Elaine," I surprised myself by crying. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quiet tears, the kind that come from carrying too much for too long. When I finally composed myself, I told her everything. The messages, the affair, the lies, the manipulation, the months of secrecy. Linda listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Do you have copies of the evidence?" "Yes." "Good." Then she asked another question, one that changed everything. "Have you reviewed your finances recently?" I blinked. "What do you mean? Bank accounts? Investments? Retirement funds? Property records?" I shook my head. "Richard handles most of that." The moment the words left my mouth, I saw concern flash across her face. Not panic, concern, professional concern, the kind that comes from experience. "Elaine," she said gently, "that's something we need to look at immediately." An uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. Until that moment, I hadn't considered money, not seriously. I assumed the financial side of our life remained intact. I assumed Richard's deception was limited to the affair. I assumed wrong. Over the following week, Linda helped me gather documents, tax returns, bank statements, retirement records, property information, credit reports. At first, everything appeared normal. Then small inconsistencies began appearing. Tiny things. Missing transfers. Unfamiliar withdrawals. Transactions I didn't recognize. The first discovery involved jewelry. Thousands of dollars. Not one purchase. Several. I stared at the records. Diamond earrings, a luxury bracelet, an expensive necklace. Gifts I had never received. Gifts I had never seen. My chest tightened. I didn't need anyone to tell me where they had gone. The answer was obvious. Megan. The next discovery was worse. Travel expenses. Hotels. Flights. Weekend getaways. Entire trips that had supposedly been business-related. Every receipt told a story. Every charge represented another lie. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing documents late into the night, adding numbers, calculating totals, trying not to think about what they represented. Eventually, I stopped counting, because the amount no longer mattered. The principle did. Then Linda called. "I found something." The seriousness in her voice immediately frightened me. "What is it?" "There appears to be another account." My heart skipped. "Another account. One you aren't listed on." I felt cold. Suddenly, very cold. Richard and I had always maintained joint finances, at least officially. The existence of a separate account was shocking. The contents were worse. Over several years, Richard had quietly transferred money into it. Not enormous amounts at once. Small amounts. Consistent amounts. Careful amounts. The kind designed to avoid attention. Enough that no single transaction seemed suspicious. But together, the total exceeded $100,000. I couldn't speak. I simply stared at the paperwork. $100,000. Hidden, while pretending we shared everything, while assuring me there were no secrets, while building a future with another woman. The betrayal hit differently than the affair. An affair wounds your heart. Financial deception attacks your sense of security, your future, your stability, everything you thought you could rely upon. I spent the next several days moving through life like a ghost, cooking meals, answering phone calls, smiling at neighbors, pretending nothing had changed, all while carrying knowledge that threatened to collapse my entire world. Then came the discovery that truly terrified me. The house, our house, the home where we had raised Sarah and Daniel, the home where our grandchildren played, the home filled with 35 years of memories. Linda noticed paperwork connected to a recent consultation with a real estate advisor. Nothing finalized, nothing signed, but enough to raise concerns. When she showed me the documents, my hands started shaking Richard had been exploring options, selling, restructuring ownership, liquidating assets, preparing for something. The realization struck with brutal clarity. Richard wasn't simply having an affair. He wasn't simply lying. He was planning an exit, planning a future, planning a life beyond me. And he was doing it while ensuring he benefited as much as possible. That night, I sat across from him during dinner, watching him eat, watching him discuss local news, watching him complain about traffic. Ordinary conversation, ordinary behavior. Yet nothing about him felt ordinary anymore. I kept wondering the same thing. How long had he been preparing? Months, years. At one point, he smiled at me. The same familiar smile I'd trusted for decades. And suddenly, I understood something horrifying. The man sitting across from me wasn't the man I thought I married. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. "Everything okay?" he asked. I forced myself to smile. "Just tired." His expression softened. "You should rest more." The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m, I walked downstairs and sat alone in the dark. The house felt different now, almost like a museum. Every room contained memories. Sarah's graduation photos, Daniel's childhood trophies, family Christmases, anniversaries, vacations, decades of life. And according to Richard's plans, all of it might have been reduced to assets, numbers, property values, money. I thought about Megan, about the future Richard had promised her, the vacations, the retirement dreams, the life together. Suddenly, those promises looked different. Because where exactly did Richard expect the money for that future to come from? The answer was sitting in front of me. Our savings, our home, our shared life, everything we had built together. For the first time since discovering the affair, anger overwhelmed grief. Not rage, not revenge, something colder, clearer, determination. Richard believed he was the only person planning ahead. He believed he controlled the information, the money, the future. But he was wrong. Because now I knew. And once a lie is exposed, it begins to lose its power. The next morning, I met with Linda again. She reviewed additional documents, created timelines, outlined options, prepared strategies. Before I left, she looked directly at me. "Elaine, you need to understand something." "What?" "You are not powerless." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Because for months I had felt powerless, betrayed, manipulated, alone. Linda continued. "Whatever Richard is planning, he hasn't finished yet." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you still have time." Time. The one thing I thought I'd lost. As I drove home, I repeated those words over and over. You still have time. Richard thought he was building a secret future. What he didn't realize was that I had begun building something too. A case. A plan. And eventually, a reckoning. What I still didn't know was that the next major confrontation wouldn't happen in a lawyer's office or a courtroom. It would happen at a family celebration. A place where Richard believed he was safest, and where, for the first time, I would come face to face with Megan Harper herself. If someone had told me 6 months earlier that I would one day stand in the same room as my husband's mistress and smile politely at her, I would have thought they were insane. Yet that's exactly what happened. And it happened during my granddaughter Emily's 16th birthday party. Of all places, of all days, the celebration was supposed to be joyful. Emily had been planning it for months. Sarah and her husband rented a beautiful event space just outside Columbus. Nothing extravagant, just elegant enough to make a 16-year-old girl feel special. Family, friends, music, food, laughter. The kind of evening grandparents dream about. The kind of evening that should have been filled with nothing but happiness. Instead, it became one of the most emotionally exhausting nights of my life. The moment I arrived, I saw Richard doing what Richard always did best, performing. He stood near the entrance greeting guests, shaking hands, telling jokes, making people laugh. His smile looked effortless, natural, warm. Watching him, no one would have guessed he was secretly involved with another woman. No one would have guessed he was hiding money from his wife. No one would have guessed he had spent months planning a future built on deception. To everyone else, he was simply Richard Bates, beloved husband, proud father, devoted grandfather. The role fit him perfectly, and that made the truth even more infuriating. "Look who's here," he said when he saw me. He kissed my cheek, wrapped an arm around my shoulders. The gesture looked affectionate. To anyone watching, we appeared happy, solid, united. I smiled back. Years of marriage had taught me how to perform too. Inside, however, I felt nothing but distance. A stranger holding another stranger. That was all we were now. As guests continued arriving, I tried focusing on Emily. She looked beautiful. Her excitement reminded me of Sarah at the same age. Watching her laugh with friends gave me brief moments of peace. Brief moments when I almost forgot everything else. Almost. Then Frank Morrison arrived. Frank had been Richard's closest friend for over 20 years. They golfed together, attended football games together, shared countless business lunches. If Richard had secrets, Frank likely knew some of them. That thought made me study him more closely than usual. "Elaine," Frank said warmly. He hugged me, asked about the grandchildren, complimented the decorations. Perfectly normal conversation. Yet I couldn't stop wondering. Did he know? Had Richard told him about Megan? Had he helped cover for him? The uncertainty bothered me. But before I could think about it further, another guest arrived. And suddenly, the air left my lungs. A woman entered beside one of Richard's business associates. Medium height, dark blonde hair, professional dress, confident smile. Around 50 years old. Not young, not flashy, not dramatic, just attractive in a quiet, mature way. I recognized her immediately from photographs. Megan Harper. For a moment, the room seemed to blur around me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Not because I was surprised she existed. I already knew she did. But seeing her in person felt different. Real. Painfully real. This wasn't a name on a phone screen anymore. This wasn't a social media profile. This was the woman receiving my husband's promises. The woman Richard claimed to love. The woman who believed she had a future with him. And she was standing 20 feet away from me, completely unaware of who I truly was. I watched carefully. Megan greeted several people, smiled, made small talk. Then Richard approached. The interaction lasted only seconds, far too brief for anyone else to notice. But I noticed, because I was watching, because I had spent months learning their patterns. There was a flicker of recognition between them. A glance, a subtle smile, an invisible conversation. Nothing obvious, nothing inappropriate, but enough to confirm everything. Then something unexpected happened. Richard brought her over, directly toward me. For a split second, panic flashed through me. Surely not. Surely he wouldn't. Yet he did. "Lane," he said casually, "I'd like you to meet Megan Harper." The sheer audacity nearly stole my breath. Megan extended her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you." Finally. The word caught my attention immediately. Finally. Which meant Richard had talked about me. Frequently enough that meeting me felt significant. I forced a smile. "And you?" Our hands touched. For just a moment, I looked directly into her eyes, and what I saw shocked me. Not arrogance, not triumph, not guilt, nothing I expected. Instead, I saw nervousness. Genuine nervousness. Almost as if she desperately wanted me to like her. The realization unsettled me. Richard continued speaking. "Megan works with a commercial real estate group we've partnered with recently." The lie rolled off his tongue effortlessly. Months earlier. I might have admired how smooth he sounded. Now it simply disgusted me. We exchanged polite conversation. Nothing unusual. Weather. The event. Emily. Community projects. Ordinary topics. Yet beneath every word ran a current of tension only I could feel. At one point, Megan mentioned a charity fundraiser she had organized. As she spoke, I noticed something. She seemed kind. Not perfect. Not innocent. But kind. The observation irritated me. I didn't want complexity. I wanted certainty. I wanted a villain. Instead, I found a human being. And humans are harder to hate. The conversation ended after a few minutes. Megan excused herself. Richard moved on to greet other guests. I remained where I stood, trying to steady my breathing, trying to process what had just happened. A few minutes later, Sarah joined me. "You okay?" "Mom." I nodded. "Just tired." "You should sit down." Maybe she was right, because emotional exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm me. Watching Richard move through the room felt surreal. He interacted effortlessly with everyone. Emily, Sarah, Daniel, friends, neighbors, and occasionally Megan. Always carefully, always subtly, never enough to attract suspicion. The man had become an expert at deception. Later that evening, I stepped outside for fresh air. The summer sky had begun darkening. Music drifted through the open doors behind me. Laughter echoed from inside. For a few moments, I stood alone, breathing, thinking, trying to regain control of my emotions. Then I heard footsteps. When I turned around, Megan was standing there, alone. My pulse quickened immediately. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then she smiled politely. "Beautiful evening." "Yes." She looked back toward the party. "Emily seems like a wonderful girl." "She is." Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable exactly. Just strange. Eventually, Megan spoke again. "You must be very proud of your family." The comment hit harder than she intended, because she sounded sincere, completely sincere. And suddenly, I understood something that changed the entire situation. Megan genuinely believed she was talking to a woman whose marriage was already ending. A woman emotionally detached from Richard. A woman ready to move on. She had no idea she was standing beside someone who still shared a home, a bed, and a life with him. No idea. The realization settled over me like ice, because for months I had wondered whether Megan knew the truth. Now I had my answer. She didn't. Not even close. When we returned inside, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief conversation. The more I replayed it, the more certain I became. Richard wasn't merely maintaining an affair. He was managing two realities simultaneously. And Megan was living inside a carefully constructed fantasy. A fantasy he had built. A fantasy he controlled. A fantasy that would eventually collapse. The question was no longer whether I would expose the truth. The question was how. Because after meeting Megan face to face, one thing became painfully clear. She wasn't the person I needed to destroy. She was another victim. And for the first time, I began considering a possibility that had never occurred to me before. Maybe the most devastating thing I could do wasn't confront Richard. Maybe it was tell Megan the truth. All of it. Every lie. Every secret. Every hidden plan. Because if I did that, the entire illusion Richard had built might come crashing down in a single day. And soon, I would decide to make that happen. After Emily's birthday party, I stopped thinking like a wife. I started thinking like a woman trying to survive. That may sound cold, maybe even heartless, but there comes a point when grief becomes exhausting, when tears stop helping, when heartbreak transforms into something quieter, something sharper, clarity. For months, I had focused on Richard, his affair, his lies, his manipulation, his secret plans. Yet after meeting Megan face to face, my perspective changed. Not completely. I wasn't suddenly sympathetic to the relationship. I wasn't willing to excuse what had happened. But I could no longer ignore one uncomfortable truth. Megan Harper wasn't behaving like someone who knew she was helping destroy a marriage. She was behaving like someone who believed a marriage had already ended. And those are two very different things. The realization followed me everywhere. While grocery shopping, while folding laundry, while lying awake at night. I kept replaying our brief conversation outside the party. The nervousness in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice, The way she spoke about family, about Emily, about life. Nothing about that interaction felt calculated. Nothing felt cruel. Eventually, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What if Megan knew everything? The answer came immediately. Then she would have acted differently. Far differently. No. Richard had been feeding her the same kind of carefully crafted lies he fed everyone else, only tailored for a different audience. That thought disturbed me more than I wanted to admit, because it transformed the story. Instead of a husband, a wife, and a mistress, I saw something else. A professional liar. And two women living inside different versions of his fiction. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the evidence folder again. The collection had grown enormous. Screenshots, financial records, travel receipts, property documents, messages, emails, timelines, patterns. Every piece of information told the same story. Richard controlled information. He revealed only what benefited him. Nothing more. As I scrolled through the files, a particular message caught my attention. I had read it before, several times, but now it felt different. Megan had written, "Sometimes I worry you'll change your mind." Richard responded, "I've waited years for this chance. I wouldn't risk everything if I wasn't serious." I stared at those words. Years. He claimed to have waited years. Another lie. Because he hadn't been waiting. He had been living comfortably, sharing a home with me, enjoying our finances, maintaining his reputation, watching grandchildren grow up. Nothing about his life suggested sacrifice. Yet somehow Megan believed she was witnessing a man fighting for love. The manipulation was astonishing. That evening, I met with Linda Foster again. We reviewed additional financial documents, discussed legal strategies, prepared for possibilities. Near the end of the meeting, I surprised her. "I want to talk about Megan." Linda looked up immediately. "What about her?" "I don't think she knows the truth." The attorney remained silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "That's possible. More than possible." I explained what I had observed. The messages, the party, the contradictions, everything. When I finished, Linda leaned back in her chair. "What are you considering?" I hesitated, because saying it aloud made it real. "I think I need to tell her." The room became very quiet. Linda studied me carefully. "Why?" The answer arrived faster than expected. "Because Richard has controlled the story for too long." The attorney nodded thoughtfully. I continued. "If Megan stays in the dark, he keeps controlling everything. If she learns the truth, he loses that control." Linda remained silent. Then she asked a question I hadn't fully considered. "What outcome are you hoping for?" I thought about it carefully. "Revenge? No. Not exactly. Humiliation? Not that either. Justice closer." Finally, I answered, "The truth." And for the first time in months, I realized that answer was genuine. I didn't want to destroy Megan. I wanted her to see reality. The same reality I had been forced to see. The same reality Richard worked so hard to hide. A few days later, I made my decision. I would contact her. Not immediately, not emotionally, not impulsively, carefully, deliberately, the way Linda had taught me. That night, I sat alone in my office organizing evidence. Not everything, only what mattered. Only what would expose the lies. Family photographs, recent photographs, pictures from holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. Proof that Richard and I were still living a shared life. Then financial documents. Not every page, only the most revealing. Records showing hidden accounts, travel expenses, luxury purchases, evidence of deception. Most importantly, I included screenshots of specific conversations. Messages where Richard contradicted himself. Messages proving he had told completely different stories to different people. By midnight, a thick folder sat on my desk. I stared at it for a long time. That folder represented the collapse of an illusion. Not just mine. Megan's too. Part of me felt guilty. Strangely guilty. Because despite everything, I knew what would happen once she saw it. Her world would break, the same way mine had. No woman deserves that. Not even a woman involved with your husband. I understood that now. The next morning, I drove to a nearby park. I often went there when I needed to think. The walking trail circled a small lake. The scenery usually calmed me. Not that day. My thoughts refused to settle. As I walked, I imagined possible outcomes. Maybe Megan would refuse to believe me. Maybe she'd accuse me of lying. Maybe she'd defend Richard. Maybe she'd warn him. Every possibility carried risks. But another possibility felt far more important. Maybe she would finally learn the truth. And maybe that truth would matter. Halfway around the lake, my phone rang. It was Sarah. We talked about Emily's party, school activities, family plans, normal things. At one point, she mentioned Richard. Dad seemed really happy at the party. The comment almost made me laugh. Happy. Of course he did. He believed he was winning. He believed nobody knew. He believed his lies remained intact. What Sarah didn't realize was that the foundation beneath those lies was already cracking. The only question was how long it would take before everything collapsed. That evening, Richard returned home unusually cheerful. He made dinner, opened a bottle of wine, talked about future travel plans. Future plans. The phrase nearly made me choke. I sat across from him listening, watching, studying. And suddenly, I understood something important. Richard genuinely believed I would forgive him if the truth emerged. Maybe not immediately, maybe after tears and arguments, but eventually. History supported that belief. After all, I always had before. Every secret, every betrayal, every disappointment. I had forgiven them all, and that confidence had made him careless, dangerously careless. Because he still viewed me as the same woman, the woman who protected the marriage at any cost, the woman who prioritized peace over truth. The woman who accepted explanations instead of demanding accountability. He had no idea she was gone. No idea she had disappeared the night she read Megan's messages. No idea someone stronger had taken her place. Later that night, after Richard went to bed, I sat alone in the darkness. The folder rested beside me on the table. Evidence, truth, reality. I reached for it and ran my fingers across the cover. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow I would take the next step. Tomorrow I would contact Megan Harper. Tomorrow, Richard's carefully constructed fantasy would begin to unravel. And for the first time since discovering the affair, I wasn't afraid. I was ready, because the truth wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a gift. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. And soon, I would place that gift directly into Megan's hands. The morning I contacted Megan Harper, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my phone. Not because I was afraid of her, because I knew what I was about to do. I was about to destroy an illusion. And no matter how justified the truth may be, watching someone's world collapse is never easy. For several minutes, I stared at her contact information. I had obtained it legally through public records and information connected to documents Richard had carelessly left behind. All I needed to do was send a message. Simple, a few words. Yet I couldn't bring myself to type them. I kept imagining her reaction: confusion, anger, disbelief, heartbreak. Eventually, I reminded myself of something important. Richard had created this situation. Not me. Not Megan. Richard. Taking a deep breath, I finally sent the message. Hello, Megan. My name is Elaine Bates. I believe we need to talk. It concerns Richard. The reply arrived 27 minutes later. 27 agonizing minutes. Is this some kind of joke? I stared at the screen, then answered honestly. No. Several minutes passed. Then another message appeared. What do you want? I considered dozens of possible responses. In the end, I chose the simplest. The truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. Her reply didn't come for nearly an hour. When it finally arrived, it consisted of only 3 words. Where should we meet? 3 days later, I sat inside a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. I arrived early. Far too early. The folder rested beside me on the table. A thick manila envelope containing months of evidence. Months of pain. Months of lies. The same envelope that would eventually appear in the opening scene of this story. I ordered coffee I never drank. Checked the time repeatedly. Watched the entrance. At exactly 2 o'clock, Megan walked in. The moment she saw me, she froze. For a brief second, neither of us moved. Then she slowly approached. The nervousness on her face was impossible to miss. I stood. She stood. Neither offered a handshake. Neither smiled. Finally, she sat down. Richard doesn't know about this meeting. It wasn't a question. I nodded. No. Megan looked relieved. That surprised me. For several seconds, she simply stared at the table. Then she spoke. What is this about? I studied her carefully. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from uncertainty, waiting, worrying, loving someone who keeps making promises. I recognized it immediately, because I had lived it too. What has Richard told you about me? The question clearly caught her off guard. What has he told you? She hesitated. A long hesitation, the kind that reveals more than words. Eventually, she answered. He said your marriage has been over for years. The statement hurt, even though I expected it. He said you stayed together because of family obligations. Another lie. He said you were preparing for a divorce. I closed my eyes briefly. Every sentence confirmed what I already suspected. Richard had constructed an entirely fictional version of our life. When I opened my eyes again, Megan was studying me carefully. You don't look surprised. I'm not. The room fell silent. Outside, people walked past the windows. Cars moved through intersections. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, inside that small coffee shop, 2 lives were about to change forever. I reached for the envelope. Slowly, deliberately. Megan watched every movement. What is that? The truth. The same answer I had given days earlier. This time, however, I placed it directly in front of her. For several seconds, she didn't touch it, almost as if she already sensed what waited inside. Then, finally, she opened it. The first photograph slipped into view, a recent family picture. Me, Richard, Sarah, Daniel, Emily. Taken just 4 months earlier, Christmas. We were smiling, standing together, looking very much like a family. Megan frowned. What's this? I said nothing. She continued looking through the contents. More photographs, family gatherings, birthday celebrations, vacations, anniversaries, pictures taken throughout the previous year. With every page, her expression changed. Confusion first, then discomfort, then concern, then fear. Real fear. These are recent. Yes. She looked up. Richard said, I know what Richard said. The color began leaving her face. Slowly, noticeably. Then she found the next section. Financial documents, bank records, property records, retirement statements. Proof that Richard and I still shared our finances, still shared our home, still shared our life. Megan read in silence. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, she whispered, No. The word barely reached my ears. No. She repeated it again, as if repetition might somehow make the evidence disappear. I understood. Because I had done the same thing months earlier. Then she reached the screenshots. The messages. Not messages between Richard and me. Messages where Richard contradicted himself. Messages proving he had told completely different stories depending on his audience. One conversation in particular stopped her cold. In it, Richard told her he had not celebrated an anniversary with me in years. Attached beside it was a photograph. Our anniversary dinner. Time-stamped. Dated. Undeniable. Megan stared at it for a long time. Then another and another. Each page stripping away another layer of illusion. Eventually, Tears appeared. At first, only a few. Then, more. She didn't try hiding them. Neither did I. There are moments in life when pride becomes irrelevant. This was one of them. I loved him. The words escaped her unexpectedly, not directed at me, not even directed at herself, simply spoken aloud, a painful truth. I nodded slowly. I know. Her eyes snapped toward me. You know. Yes. The tears came faster now. He told me we were building a future. I swallowed hard. I know. He said everything was almost finalized. I know. He said... Her voice broke completely. The sentence never finished. It didn't need to. Because I already knew the rest. I had read every promise, every fantasy, every lie. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The weight of reality filled the space between us. Finally, Megan asked the question I had been waiting for. How long have you known? Months. Her eyes widened. Months. I nodded. Why didn't you confront him? The answer came immediately. Because he would have lied. Megan looked away. The sad part was that she knew I was right. Then something unexpected happened. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, opened a folder, and slowly turned the screen toward me. What if I told you this isn't everything? My stomach tightened immediately. What do you mean? Her expression hardened. Not toward me, toward Richard, for the first time since arriving. I saw anger replacing heartbreak. Real anger. He lied to both of us. She tapped the screen. Emails appeared. Messages. Voice recordings. Documents. Evidence I had never seen before. Evidence proving Richard's deception went even deeper than I imagined. Far deeper. And suddenly, I realized this meeting wasn't ending the story. It was only exposing how much bigger the story truly was. Because Megan Harper had just revealed something that changed everything. Richard wasn't merely planning an affair. He was planning an escape. And both of us had been funding it. For a long moment after Megan turned her phone toward me, neither of us spoke. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too ordinary for the conversation we were having. I stared at the screen. There were dozens of folders, emails, audio files, photographs, documents, records. Far more than I expected. Far more than Richard could have imagined either of us possessed. What is all this? I finally asked. Megan swallowed hard. Everything I saved. Her voice sounded different now. The heartbreak was still there. But another emotion had begun replacing it. Anger. Not reckless anger. Focused anger. The kind that appears when grief finally transforms into clarity. She opened one folder. Immediately, I recognized Richard's voice. The recording had been made during a phone conversation. I listened carefully. Richard sounded relaxed, confident, certain. The way people sound when they believe nobody will ever hear their lies repeated back to them. I've already spoken to attorneys. The recording crackled softly. It's just taking longer than expected. I felt my stomach tighten because I knew that statement was impossible. He had never spoken to divorce attorneys. At least not seriously. Linda had already checked. There was no evidence of any legal filing. No separation process. Nothing. The recording continued. Once the house is sold, everything changes. Megan paused the audio. Her eyes met mine. He said that dozens of times. The words hung heavily between us. The house. Again. Always the house. The center of every future plan he described. The same house where I still lived. The same house he claimed was part of a dying marriage. The same house whose value apparently funded the fantasy he sold to Megan. My chest tightened. Not from surprise. From realization. Richard hadn't simply been cheating. He had been using our shared future as currency, making promises he wasn't entitled to make, spending assets that didn't belong solely to him. Megan opened another file. This time it was an email. A long one. Richard had written it after one of their arguments. The subject line alone made my heart sink. Please don't give up on us. I watched Megan scroll, paragraph after paragraph filled with promises. Plans. Declarations of love. Commitments. A future together. Then came a sentence that made me physically recoil. I've sacrificed years of happiness trying to do the right thing. Years of happiness. The phrase nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd. While he described himself as trapped in suffering, he had been living comfortably, enjoying family holidays, celebrating anniversaries, maintaining his public image, protecting his finances. Nothing about his life resembled sacrifice. Megan looked away. He was very convincing. There was shame in her voice. Unnecessary shame. I understood it immediately because I felt something similar. The embarrassment of believing someone. The humiliation of realizing you were manipulated. I shook my head. No. She frowned. No what? This isn't your fault. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then tears filled her eyes again. Not the devastating tears from earlier. Different tears. The kind that appear when someone finally feels understood. I should have known. You trusted someone you loved. So did you. Neither of us could argue with that. The painful truth was obvious. We were sitting on opposite sides of the same disaster. Different roles. Different experiences. Same liar. Megan took a long breath. Then she opened another folder. This one contained photographs. Not romantic photographs. Business photographs. Property photographs. Construction sites. Buildings. Documents. At first, I didn't understand. Then, she explained. Richard wasn't only talking about leaving. What do you mean? He was talking about investments. My pulse quickened. What kind of investments? Megan hesitated. Then she showed me commercial property proposals, business opportunities, potential purchases, financial plans, retirement developments. The documents revealed something troubling. Richard wasn't simply dreaming about a future. He was actively preparing one. A future funded by resources he did not fully own. a future built using assumptions that depended on deceiving both of us. The realization hit like a punch. For months, I had imagined a man trapped between two relationships. The truth was worse. Richard had been building an escape route. Carefully, methodically, and neither woman involved possessed the full picture. Until now. Megan suddenly laughed. The sound startled me, not because it was joyful, because it wasn't. It was the bitter laugh of someone realizing how ridiculous a situation has become. What? She shook her head. I spent 2 years feeling guilty. The words came out quietly. I thought I was hurting a woman who had already moved on. I remained silent. There were nights I cried because I thought I was selfish. Her voice trembled. I kept telling myself everything would make sense eventually. A long pause followed. Then she added, Now I realize neither of us knew who he really was. The statement hurt because it felt true. Painfully true. 35 years. 35 years of marriage. And somehow, I was still uncovering new versions of Richard. New lies. New masks. New manipulations. Eventually, our conversation shifted. Not toward blame. Not toward revenge. Toward facts. For the next 2 hours, we compared information. My evidence. Her evidence. My documents. Her documents. The picture grew clearer with every passing minute. The affair timeline, financial transfers, travel records, contradictions, false promises, hidden plans. By the time we finished, the truth looked far larger than either of us originally understood. At one point, Megan leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. So what happens now? The question lingered between us, because until then, we had focused entirely on the past. Now we were staring at the future. I considered the possibilities. Expose him immediately. Confront him privately. Proceed legally. Tell the children. Tell everyone. There were countless options. But one thing had become absolutely clear. Richard could no longer control the narrative. Not after this. Not after both sides finally possessed the same information. I don't know exactly what happens next, I admitted. But I know what doesn't happen. Megan looked at me. What? We don't let him divide us. The words surprised even me. Yet the moment I said them, I knew they were true, because that had always been Richard's advantage. Isolation. Different stories for different people. Carefully managed information. As long as nobody compared notes. He remained safe. Now that advantage was gone. Megan nodded slowly. I agree. For the first time since we met, there was something resembling solidarity between us. Not friendship. Not yet. Perhaps never. But understanding. Mutual understanding. And that mattered. As the afternoon faded into evening, we finally stood to leave. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. I felt as though I had lived an entire year inside a single day. Near the door, Megan stopped. There's something else. My stomach tightened immediately. Something else. Those 3 words had become dangerous. What is it? She hesitated, then reached into her purse. This time, she removed a small envelope. Different from mine. Smaller. Thinner. Yet somehow more threatening. "What's inside?" Her expression hardened. The heartbreak was gone now. Only determination remained. Proof. Proof of what? She looked directly into my eyes. Proof that Richard lied to Sarah and Daniel too. My breath caught. The children. Why would he involve the children? Megan slowly handed me the envelope. I opened it. Read the first page, then the second, then the third. With every line, disbelief grew stronger. Because Richard hadn't merely deceived us. He had been quietly shaping how our own children viewed the future, preparing them, influencing them, positioning himself as the victim before the truth ever emerged. When I finally looked up, Megan already knew what I was thinking. This can't stay hidden anymore. No, it couldn't. The affair had already destroyed enough. But now the lies were spreading into every corner of our family. And for the first time, a plan began forming. Not revenge, not humiliation, accountability. A moment where every lie would finally be forced into the light. A moment where Richard would no longer decide which version of reality everyone received. And as Megan and I walked out of that coffee shop together, I realized something remarkable. The two women Richard believed would never speak to each other were now standing on the same side. And that was the one outcome he had never planned for. After my meeting with Megan, everything changed. Not on the surface. On the surface, Richard's life continued exactly as before. He still left home every morning, believing he controlled the situation. He still smiled during family dinners. He still called Sarah and Daniel regularly. He still talked about future plans as though nothing had happened. He still thought he was the smartest person in every room. That confidence would become his downfall. Because for the first time in years, Richard Bates was operating without complete information. And he had no idea. The following week became one of the most exhausting periods of my life. Not emotionally, strategically. Every day involved planning, preparing, verifying, organizing. Linda Foster became the center of that effort. The moment I showed her the evidence Megan provided, she understood the situation had grown much larger than a simple affair. We spent hours reviewing documents, emails, audio recordings, financial records, property information, timelines. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. Every lie mattered. One afternoon, Linda looked up from a stack of papers and shook her head. "I've handled divorce cases for 30 years. That statement immediately caught my attention. And it takes effort to maintain this many lies. I almost laughed. Because she was right. Richard hadn't stumbled into this situation. He had built it. Carefully, deliberately, brick by brick. Just like the buildings his company constructed. The difference was that this structure wasn't made of concrete. It was made of deception. And now cracks were appearing everywhere. The most disturbing discovery involved Sarah and Daniel. The documents Megan provided confirmed something I had feared. Richard had been quietly preparing them for months. Not directly. Not obviously. Subtly. Through carefully chosen conversations, comments, suggestions, narratives. Little seeds planted over time. Seeds designed to protect him if the truth emerged. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Then I read the evidence. One message from Richard to Megan stood out immediately. The kids already understand how difficult my marriage has become. The statement made my blood run cold. Because neither child knew anything about marital difficulties. At least not from me, which meant Richard had been creating that perception himself, little by little. Conversation by conversation. A few days later, I decided to test the theory. I invited Sarah to lunch. Nothing unusual, just mother and daughter spending time together. Halfway through the meal, I casually mentioned retirement, then marriage, then relationships. Eventually, I asked, "Have you ever thought your father seemed unhappy?" Sarah hesitated. The hesitation told me everything. "Why would you ask that?" I kept my voice calm. "Just curious." She stirred her drink. Well, there it was. That word. Well, the beginning of a truth she didn't even realize had been planted. He's mentioned feeling lonely sometimes. I felt my stomach tighten. Lonely. The same word Richard had used against me. The same narrative. The same script. He has... Sarah nodded. Nothing major. Of course not. Nothing major. Because manipulation rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly, wrapped in concern, disguised as honesty. I listened carefully as Sarah continued. He said retirement changed things. What things? He didn't really explain, but I knew. Richard never explained directly. He implied, suggested, guided, allowed other people to draw conclusions. That way, the story became theirs instead of his. A brilliant tactic, and a dangerous one. 2 days later, I met Daniel for coffee. The conversation unfolded almost identically. Different words, same theme. He seems stressed lately. He talks about feeling disconnected. I think he's trying his best. By the time I returned home, my heart felt heavy. Not because my children had done anything wrong, because they trusted their father. And Richard had weaponized that trust. That realization hardened my resolve. The confrontation could no longer remain private. Too many people had been manipulated. Too many relationships poisoned. Too many lies left unchallenged. A week later, Linda called with an update. "We're ready!" Those 2 words sent a wave of nervous energy through me. Ready? The moment had finally arrived. For months, I had lived inside uncertainty. Now, everything was moving toward a single point, a single confrontation, a single truth. "What exactly do we do?" I asked. Linda's answer was simple. "We let Richard explain himself." I frowned. "That's it?" "No." A slight smile appeared. "We let him explain himself while everyone already knows the facts." The brilliance of that approach struck me immediately. For years, Richard survived through controlling information. This time, information would already be in the room. He wouldn't be able to rewrite reality fast enough. The plan developed quickly after that. A family gathering. Not public. Not humiliating. Not theatrical. Private. Controlled. Focused. Sarah and Daniel would attend. So would Linda. And eventually, Megan. The thought of bringing everyone together made me anxious, terrified, actually, but there was no alternative anymore. The truth had become too large, too interconnected, too important. 3 days before the meeting, Megan and I spoke again. It still felt strange talking to her. Strange how quickly circumstances can transform people. A few months earlier, I considered her the woman who ruined my life. Now she was helping me expose the man who nearly ruined both of ours. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. "No." The honesty surprised both of us. Then I added, "But I'm ready enough." Megan laughed softly. "I feel the same." A long silence followed. Then she asked something unexpected. "Do you think he ever loved either of us?" The question lingered, heavy, complicated, painful. I thought carefully before answering. "Yes." She looked surprised. I continued. "I think Richard loved what people gave him." "What does that mean?" I stared out the window. "It means I think he loved being admired, being needed, being forgiven, being trusted, being believed. Maybe those things felt like love to him. Maybe he convinced himself they were. I didn't know. What I did know was this: real love doesn't require constant deception. Real love doesn't survive on manipulation. Real love doesn't demand that two women live inside different realities. Megan nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke again for several seconds, because there wasn't much left to say. The truth had already said enough. The night before the confrontation, I barely slept. Every possible outcome played through my mind. Richard denying everything. Richard blaming me. Richard attacking Megan. Richard crying. Richard apologizing. Richard begging. The possibilities felt endless. Around 3 a.m, I walked downstairs and sat alone in the dark. The house was silent. The same house where I had spent 35 years building a life. The same house Richard had quietly planned to leave. Tomorrow, everything would change. One way or another. As dawn approached, I found myself standing in front of a family photograph, a recent one. Before I knew the truth, before everything collapsed, for a moment, I studied Richard's face. The smile, the confidence, the certainty. And suddenly, I understood something. Richard genuinely believed he would survive this. Not legally, emotionally. He believed he could talk his way out, charm his way out, manipulate his way out. Because history had always rewarded him. Every secret, every betrayal, every mistake. Someone eventually forgave him. Someone eventually protected him from consequences. But tomorrow would be different. Because for the first time in his life, every person he depended on would be sitting in the same room, listening to the same facts, seeing the same evidence. And Richard Bates would no longer control which version of reality they received. The trap was ready. The evidence was ready. The witnesses were ready. And most importantly, I was ready. The only person who didn't know it yet was Richard. The confrontation happened on a Sunday evening, a quiet Sunday. The kind of evening that usually ended with family dinners and conversations about work, grandchildren, and upcoming holidays. Instead, it became the night my marriage officially died. By 6 o'clock, everyone had arrived. Sarah sat beside her husband on the living room sofa. Daniel occupied a chair near the fireplace. Linda Foster sat calmly at the dining table with a folder in front of her. I remained standing near the window. Megan hadn't arrived yet. That part was intentional. Richard couldn't know everything at once. Not yet. When he walked through the front door, carrying a bottle of wine, he looked completely relaxed, comfortable, confident. The sight almost made me angry. Almost. But anger had long since burned away. What remained was something colder, something stronger. Truth. Richard paused the moment he saw everyone gathered. His smile faded slightly. "What's going on?" No one answered immediately. The silence itself seemed to make him uneasy. He looked at Sarah, then Daniel, then me, finally Linda. His eyes narrowed. "Elaine." I took a slow breath. "We need to talk." The words sounded simple, yet they carried the weight of 35 years. Richard set the wine bottle down. "About what?" I looked directly at him. "Everything." For the first time, genuine concern appeared on his face. Not panic. Not yet. Concern. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Okay." Still calm. Still confident. Still believing he could manage whatever came next. That confidence lasted less than 5 minutes. I began gently. Not with accusations. Not with anger. With facts. Simple facts. Questions. Questions I already knew the answers to. "Have you been honest with me about your finances?" Richard blinked. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one." He shifted in his seat. "Of course." The lie arrived instantly, without hesitation, without discomfort, without shame. Linda quietly slid several documents across the table. Bank records, transfer records, account information. The color immediately drained from Richard's face. Not completely, just enough. Enough for me to see. Enough to know he recognized them. Sarah frowned. "Dad." Richard cleared his throat. "Those don't mean what you think." Of course they didn't. That was always the first defense. Confusion, misunderstanding, context. The truth was never denied immediately. It was diluted, questioned, complicated. I had seen the pattern before. This time. However, it wasn't going to work. Linda calmly explained the records, the hidden account, the transfers, the undisclosed funds, the timeline, everything. As she spoke, Sarah's expression slowly changed. Daniel's did too. Neither interrupted, neither defended him. Not yet. Richard remained silent until she finished. Then he smiled. Actually smiled. The sight shocked me, because even now, even sitting in a room full of evidence, he believed he could regain control. "Elaine, you don't understand." There it was. The familiar script. The same script he had used for years. "I don't understand. I'm overreacting. Things aren't what they seem. Only this time, I wasn't alone." "What Don't I understand? I asked. His eyes locked onto mine. I was protecting our future. The absurdity almost took my breath away. Protecting our future. By hiding money. By planning in secret. By lying. Sarah looked confused. Dad, why would you hide money from Mom? Richard immediately turned toward her. Because of course he did. He always adjusted his audience, his story, his angle. Things are more complicated than they seem. Daniel leaned forward. Then explain them.
The room grew very quiet. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time, I noticed uncertainty, a tiny crack. Nothing more, but it was there. Then I spoke again. Okay. I reached into the folder beside me. And let's talk about Megan Harper. The effect was immediate. Richard froze. Completely froze. Every ounce of confidence disappeared. Every prepared explanation vanished. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sarah looked confused.
Daniel looked confused. Then both of them looked toward their father, waiting, watching. Richard swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. The lie came automatically, instinctively. But this time, it sounded weak. Even he seemed to realize it. I slid photographs across the table. Hotel records, messages, travel confirmations, screenshots, months of evidence. Silence filled the room, a terrible silence, the kind that changes families forever. Sarah picked up one of the screenshots. Read it, then another, then another. Slowly, carefully. By the third message, tears filled her eyes. Dad? The word barely escaped her lips. Daniel's reaction was different. His face turned red, not with embarrassment, with rage. Pure rage. You cheated on Mom. Richard immediately raised his hands. It wasn't like that. The sentence exploded through the room, not because it was loud, because it was pathetic. 35 years of marriage. Months of deception. And that was the best explanation he could offer. It wasn't like that. Daniel stood abruptly. What does that even mean? Sit down. No. Richard's voice hardened. Daniel. No. My son had rarely challenged his father growing up. Rarely. That ended tonight. You lied to Mom. You lied to us. You lied to everyone. Richard looked trapped. Because for once, there was no room to maneuver. No isolated conversation. No separate narratives. No private explanations. Everyone was hearing the same information simultaneously. Exactly as Linda predicted. Then came the moment that changed everything. The front door opened. Every head turned. Richard turned too. And the second he saw who entered, the last bit of color disappeared from his face. Megan. She stepped into the room quietly, calmly, confidently. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The shock was overwhelming. Sarah looked from Megan to Richard, then back again. Understanding arrived instantly. "Oh my God!" Richard stood. "Megan, what are you doing here?" His voice cracked. Actually cracked. The man who always had answers suddenly sounded terrified. Megan didn't respond immediately. She simply walked toward the table, placed another folder beside mine, then looked directly at him. The silence felt endless. Finally, she spoke. "I'm done protecting your lies." Richard stared at her. Why? Speechless. Megan opened the folder. Emails, messages, audio recordings. Everything. The same evidence she had shown me. Now everyone could see it. Everyone. Sarah cried openly. Daniel cursed under his breath. Even Linda looked saddened. Not surprised, but saddened. Because evidence may prove the truth. It doesn't make the truth less painful. Richard tried one final time, one desperate attempt. "You don't understand." The sentence sounded ridiculous now, hopeless, broken. Megan looked directly at him. "No." Her voice was steady. "I finally do." Then she handed Sarah a printed email. The email where Richard promised to marry Megan. The email where he described me as emotionally absent. The email where he claimed our marriage was essentially over. Sarah read it, finished, looked up, and for the first time in her life, she looked at her father like a stranger. The expression broke something inside him. I saw it happen. The realization, the understanding. The moment Richard finally recognized he had lost. Not the marriage, not the affair. Everything. The trust, the image, the loyalty, the illusion. All gone. And sitting there in the silence that followed, surrounded by the consequences of his own choices. Richard Bates finally looked exactly like what he was. Not a victim, not a misunderstood husband, not a man trapped by circumstance. Just a man who had spent too many years believing he would never be held accountable. And for the first time in a very long time, nobody was coming to save him. The silence after the confrontation felt endless. No one knew what to say. No one knew where to look. 35 years of history had just been shattered in a single evening. And sitting at the center of the wreckage was Richard. For the first time since I had known him, he looked powerless. Not physically, emotionally. The man who always controlled conversations. The man who always had explanations. The man who always found a way to shift blame. He had run out of moves. Sarah sat quietly on the couch, tears still sliding down her cheeks. Daniel remained standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. Megan stood near the doorway, exhausted, heartbroken, but strangely calm. Almost as if finally telling the truth had lifted a burden she had carried for years. Richard looked around the room, searching, desperately searching, not for facts, for allies, someone, anyone. The problem was that everyone had already seen the evidence. Every document, every message, every lie. There was nowhere left to hide. Finally, Richard spoke. "I made mistakes."
The sentence landed heavily in the room. Mistakes. Not betrayal, not deception, not manipulation. Mistakes. I almost laughed. After everything, he was still minimizing, still managing language, still trying to reduce a hurricane to a rainstorm. Daniel reacted immediately. Mistakes. His voice echoed through the room. You call this mistakes? Richard rubbed his forehead. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. The statement was so absurd that even Sarah looked away, because everyone in the room understood something simple. Intentions don't erase consequences. You don't spend years lying and then claim nobody was supposed to suffer. The suffering was inevitable. The moment he chose deception, he chose the outcome. Linda remained silent, observing, allowing Richard every opportunity to speak, every opportunity to reveal himself. And he did. More than he realized. Over the next hour, Richard attempted to explain. At first, he portrayed himself as confused, lost, unhappy. Then he portrayed himself as trapped, then misunderstood, then overwhelmed. Each version contradicted the previous one. Each explanation exposed another inconsistency. Eventually, even he seemed unable to keep track. That was the problem with maintaining multiple realities. Eventually, they collide. Eventually, the stories stop fitting together. Eventually, truth catches up. At one point, Sarah wiped tears from her face and asked the question nobody else had voiced. When were you planning to tell us? Richard froze. The hesitation answered everything. Not because he lacked an answer, because he knew the truth would sound terrible. Finally, he whispered, I don't know. Sarah nodded slowly. The disappointment in her eyes hurt more than anger ever could, because disappointment comes after hope dies. For most of her life, Sarah believed her father was the most honest man she knew. That belief was gone now, and neither apology nor explanation could bring it back. Daniel asked the next question. Were you ever going to tell Mom the truth? Another silence. Another hesitation. Another answer without words. Richard looked down. That was enough. No. He wasn't going to tell me. He was going to continue until circumstances forced his hand. Just like every other lie. Megan finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. Were you ever going to tell me the truth? Richard looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, genuine regret appeared on his face. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. By then, I wasn't sure anymore. I loved you. The words escaped him suddenly, unexpectedly. Megan stared at him, then shook her head. No. Her answer was immediate. Certain. Firm. You loved being believed. The room became completely silent, because she had just said exactly what I told her days earlier. And hearing it spoken aloud made it even more powerful. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he had no response, no argument, no defense, because deep down, he knew she was right. The conversation continued late into the evening. Not as a fight, Not anymore. The fight had ended when the evidence appeared. Now it was simply the aftermath, the accounting, the consequences, the truth settling into everyone's lives. Eventually, Linda addressed practical matters, the financial issues, the legal realities, the hidden accounts, the property concerns. Richard listened quietly. His shoulders seemed smaller somehow, as if years of carefully maintained confidence were collapsing under their own weight. When Linda finished, he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all evening. Not as an obstacle, not as a spouse, not as someone he needed to convince, just as Elaine, the woman who had shared 35 years of his life. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, late, very late, yet strangely sincere. The younger version of me would have cried, would have wanted to believe him, would have searched for reasons to forgive. But that woman no longer existed. Months of betrayal had changed her. Months of lies had changed her. I nodded slowly. "I believe you're sorry." Richard looked relieved. For a brief second. Then I continued. "You're sorry because you got caught." The relief vanished instantly, because we both knew it was true. If I had never seen that message, if I had never opened that phone, if Megan and I had never compared notes, Richard would still be living 2 lives, maybe 3, maybe more. The apology wasn't the beginning of accountability. It was the result of exposure, and those are very different things. Around 10 o'clock, people finally began leaving. Sarah hugged me longer than usual. Daniel did too. Neither said much. There weren't enough words. Some wounds require time before language returns. Megan was the last to leave. She paused near the front door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I will never forget. "I spent 2 years believing you were the reason I couldn't be happy." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry." The apology surprised me deeply, because out of everyone involved, she probably owed me the least. I stepped forward, then did something I never imagined possible. I hugged her, not because I approved of what happened, not because everything was forgiven, because we both survived the same lie. And sometimes survival creates a strange kind of understanding. When she finally left, the house became quiet, completely quiet. For the first time all evening, Richard and I were alone. The silence stretched between us, heavy, final. There was nothing left to uncover, nothing left to expose, nothing left to argue about. Only consequences remained. Richard sat at the dining table. I stood near the window, the same positions where the evening had begun. Eventually he spoke. "What happens now?" A year earlier, that question would have terrified me. Now it didn't, because I already knew the answer. The uncertainty was gone. The confusion was gone. The denial was gone. Only truth remained. I looked at the man I once trusted more than anyone in the world. The man who spent years believing I would forgive him again. The man who thought he could manage every outcome. The man who never imagined I would hand his mistress the evidence myself. And for the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. But peace. Because the truth was finally free. And tomorrow, for the first time in a very long time, I would begin building a future based on reality, instead of lies. The divorce was finalized 11 months after the confrontation. 11 months. That was how long it took to legally end a marriage that had lasted 35 years. Strange, isn't it? You spend decades building something, then spend less than a year dismantling it. The paperwork itself wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was grieving a life that still existed in my memories. Because despite everything Richard had done, our marriage wasn't entirely a lie. That was the painful truth I had to learn. Some parts were real. Some moments were genuine. Some memories were beautiful. And accepting that complexity became part of my healing. The morning the divorce became official, I expected to feel triumphant, victorious, relieved. Instead, I sat alone in my car outside the courthouse and cried. Not because I regretted leaving, because I was mourning the future I thought I would have. Mourning the man I believed Richard was. Mourning the version of myself who spent years trying to save a relationship that only one person was protecting. Grief doesn't always arrive when something ends. Sometimes it arrives when you finally accept that it ended long ago. After the divorce, I sold the house. That decision surprised many people, especially Sarah. "Are you sure?" she asked repeatedly. The question made sense. The house held decades of memories, birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduations, family dinners, grandchildren running through hallways, entire chapters of our lives. But every room also carried shadows now. Every corner reminded me of secrets, of lies, of sleepless nights spent questioning reality. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life surrounded by ghosts. So I sold it. The day I handed over the keys felt strangely peaceful. Not happy. Peaceful. Like setting down a weight I had carried for far too long. A month later, I moved into a smaller home closer to Sarah and her family. Nothing extravagant, just comfortable, manageable. Mine. That last word mattered more than I expected. Mine. For years, so much of my identity had been connected to being Richard's wife. Without realizing it, I had allowed my own story to become secondary. Now I had the opportunity to discover who Elaine Bates was without him, at 64 years old. Soon 65, an age when many people believe life is supposed to slow down, shrink, become smaller. Instead, mine expanded. Slowly at first, then more quickly. I joined a community book club, volunteered at a local literacy program, started walking with a group of women every Saturday morning. Women my age, women older, women younger, many of them carrying their own stories, their own losses, their own second beginnings. One thing surprised me almost immediately. I wasn't alone, not even close. Everywhere I looked, I found women rebuilding, after divorce, after widowhood, after illness, after disappointment, after betrayal. Life had knocked them down. Yet there they were, standing, living, growing. The realization changed something inside me, because for a long time, I viewed my story as a tragedy. Eventually, I began seeing it differently. Not as an ending, as a transition, a painful one, but still a transition. Sarah became one of my greatest sources of support. So did Daniel. The relationship between them and Richard remained complicated. I suspect it always will. Trust, once broken, doesn't magically return. It rebuilds slowly, if it rebuilds at all. Still, both of my children demonstrated something remarkable. They stopped treating me like someone who needed rescuing. Instead, they treated me like someone who had survived, someone strong, someone capable. That shift mattered more than they realized. One afternoon, nearly a year after everything happened, Emily came to visit. My granddaughter was 17 by then, older, wiser, more observant than many adults. We spent the afternoon planting flowers in the backyard. At one point, she looked up and asked, "Grandma?" "Yes." "Are you happier now?" The question caught me off guard. Children have a way of asking exactly what matters. I thought carefully before answering, then smiled. "Yes." Emily smiled back. "Good." That was it. No dramatic speech, no complicated discussion, just good. And somehow that simple word felt perfect. Because happiness after heartbreak isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It appears in ordinary moments. Morning coffee, a peaceful home, a phone call from your daughter, a walk with friends, flowers growing in the backyard, the absence of constant fear, the absence of constant doubt, the absence of lies. Several months later, I received an unexpected letter. Not from Richard, from Megan. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for nearly 2 days. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to read it. Eventually, curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten note. Simple, sincere. She thanked me. Not for exposing Richard, for telling her the truth. She wrote that the truth had devastated her, but it had also saved her. Saved her from building a future based on deception. Saved her from marrying a man she didn't truly know. Saved her from spending years trapped inside someone else's fantasy. At the end of the letter, she wrote something I still think about. You gave me the one thing Richard never did. Reality. I folded the letter carefully, then placed it inside a drawer where I keep meaningful things. Because she was right. The envelope I handed Megan that day wasn't an act of revenge. At least, not in the end. It was an act of truth, and truth changes people. Sometimes painfully, sometimes permanently, but always powerfully. As for Richard, I hear occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. Nothing dramatic, nothing particularly satisfying. His life continues. Just as mine does. I don't spend much time thinking about him anymore. That may be the biggest surprise of all. For so long, I believed healing meant forgiving him. Eventually, I learned something different. Healing meant forgiving myself. Forgiving myself for ignoring warning signs. Forgiving myself for staying too long. Forgiving myself for believing someone I loved. Most importantly, forgiving myself for being human. Because trust is not weakness. Love is not weakness. Hope is not weakness. The weakness belonged to the person who exploited those things, not the person who offered them. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a woman abandoned by her husband. I don't see a victim. I don't see someone whose life was ruined by betrayal. I see Elaine Bates. A woman who survived. A woman who learned. A woman who began again. And if there's one thing this journey taught me, It's this. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop fighting to save a lie. Because the moment you choose truth, even when it hurts, you give yourself the chance to build something real. And at 65 years old, that's exactly what I did. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never wanted to learn. For many years, I believed loyalty meant enduring everything. I believed love meant endless forgiveness. I believed keeping a family together was more important than protecting myself. And what I eventually learned is that forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. Every relationship needs trust, honesty, and respect. When those things disappear, love alone cannot carry the weight forever. One of the most important lessons from my story is that age does not determine your ability to begin again. Many people believe that after 60, life becomes smaller, that opportunities disappear, that change is too difficult. The truth is exactly the opposite. Every day we wake up is another opportunity to choose ourselves, another opportunity to rebuild, another opportunity to create peace where chaos once existed. I also learned that truth is not cruelty. Sometimes telling the truth feels harsh because it destroys comfortable illusions. But living inside a lie always costs more than facing reality. And finally, I learned that self-respect matters. No matter how many years you've invested, no matter how much history you've shared, no matter how deeply you've loved someone, you deserve honesty. You deserve dignity. You deserve a life built on truth. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting yourself? What would you have done in my situation? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who may need to hear it today.